Join us this new year for new conversations at the Commonwealth Club.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual program at the Commonwealth Club of California. My name is Shara Frankel. I'm a technology reporter for the New York Times and co-author of An Ugly Truth, Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination. And I'm excited to be here today moderating today's program. I'm pleased to be joined by Senator Amy Klobuchar, senior senator from the state of Minnesota and author of the book Antitrust, Taking on Monopoly Power from the Gilded Age to the Digital Age. We live in a time of enormous income inequality, and many, including Senator Klobuchar, believe that now is the time to take action against our modern monopolies. She wrote Antitrust to help give Americans a comprehensive view of how monopolies have changed over the years and how the government has adopted in response. We'll be discussing a lot in the next hour, and I want to ask your questions too. If you're watching along with us, please put your questions in the text chat on YouTube, and we'll be getting to them later in the program. Thank you, Senator Klobuchar, for joining us.
Well, thanks, Sheila. It's great to be on. I noticed you kind of see I've done like bad Zoom hygiene. You see the window reflected, but you're also going to see it going dark in Minnesota, and then you won't see it. So, such is life. And I'm really excited to be on with you. And read your book, every single word of it. So thank you for that. And looking forward to talking about this. It literally couldn't be more timely. I've done a lot of book talks, but none at this critical time. So thanks for moderating.
Well, it's my pleasure. And I'm actually going to start by asking you a very leading question, given what you just said, which is, why is now an exciting time for your paperback to be coming out?
Because this is a moment where we're finally starting to see some momentum. And part of it has to do with the fact that this has just been going on for too long. When we got a bill recently, last Thursday, through the Judiciary Committee, we were literally able to call it the first bill, competition antitrust bill, tech bill, to pass through the Judiciary Committee to the Senate floor since the dawn of the internet. A bit overly dramatic, but that is in fact the case. And then you had everything from the Facebook whistleblower to just increasing bipartisan support, the administration taking this on with the competition summit, and the clear problem that with our conservative courts basically making it harder and harder as each year goes by to bring cases and enforce the laws, with no changes in Congress, a huge lobbying effort. It was just revealed last week that the tech companies alone spent $70 million last year lobbying against, and that doesn't even include the ad campaigns, lobbying against our legislation and similar legislation. And then you also have just a lot of people that don't like to get involved in controversy. One of the things I've noticed is Congress seems to be able to react when there's an immediate crisis, right? Hurricane, flood, financial crisis, right? We reacted with TARP and a pandemic. Can get the funding out. I'm not kidding. It is stuff that is immediate, and then these longer term problems like climate change or immigration reform or tech policy seems to be very, very difficult. Voting, not to be appropriate for last week, very difficult for people to come to yes, especially with 60 votes. So I'm very proud of our bipartisan support. And the way our group, which Samantha Bee called the Ocean's 11 of co-sponsors, have been able to stick together and not waver when it came to getting a bill done.
So I think one of the things your book does really well is give a comprehensive history of this, of why antitrust is so difficult and what are the historic problems here. I know it's really difficult to try and summarize what took whole chapters into just a couple minutes.
Yes.
But give people some of that sense, because I don't think people realize what a long and sort of fascinating history antitrust has in America.
Right. And by the way, that makes my work right now, I can put it in perspective, because some of the senators, even at the hearing, that go, this is going to be really ugly, using the word from your book. And I'm like, You think I wasn't ready for that? Look at history. You go way back to the start of our country, where some of the founding fathers actually wanted to put stuff in here about monopolies. And monopolies were a motivating force, even though the word didn't end up in the Constitution. Very big force that literally people came from England to our country because they were entrepreneurs and they didn't want to sell all their stuff, by the way, including tea purchases, to monopolies. And even the Boston Tea Party wasn't just about taxation without representation. It was also about the fact that they had to deal with a monopoly tea party in the East Indies Tea Company. So then at one point, they said, well, don't worry, the public will take care of this. We don't have to put this in the Constitution. And it took 100 years. But as these trusts started developing and things got worse and worse, that is when, first of all, Senator Sherman, brother of General Sherman, marched to the sea, and friend of Lincoln, got involved. And it's also around the time you see this driving movement, which led to Teddy Roosevelt after Democrats and Republicans started decrying the trust. State legislatures got into the act. By the way, history repeating itself, right, Shira? Because you see that happening right now, and they have limited powers, but they start passing stuff. And pretty soon the companies go, oh, whoa, we have this patchwork of laws, privacy laws, whatever. Maybe we need a federal law. Maybe we were wrong. And so over time, Roosevelt comes in, he starts busting the trusts, whether it's Standard Oil, which was actually completed by President Wilson, or whether it is financial trusts, or whether it's rail trusts, and he starts bringing actions. That continues during the progressive era. But then after that, for many other reasons, it kind of drops off for a while, picks up again with the AT&T suit, and that's kind of the heyday. And then you get to the present, where really for the last 40 years, nothing has happened, which happens to coincide with the internet. And there just has not been any laws passed to get at the problems of our time, whereas in the past, Sherman Act passed, then Clayton Act passed, things happened about every 20 years or so. And that's just not happening right now. So that's led to a lot of the consolidation, because as Bill Baer, the former head of antitrust under Obama, once said, there's deals coming before us that shouldn't be even getting out of the boardroom, because companies are going to test it. That's what they do. And if there's no pushback, as Adam Smith said, and I think everyone thinks of him as, godfather of capitalism, invisible hand, but he also said the one thing we must fear is the unbridled power of the standing army of monopolies. And also in the book, I point out some fun stuff. I have over 100 cartoons for people that like cartoons. I also have stories like the woman who invented the Monopoly game and how she got shoved aside for a guy. The only time in history, Shira, where a man took credit for a woman's work.
Never happened otherwise.
Okay. Or the story of Ida Tarbell, the woman who uncovered the Standard Oil trust and what had happened there. And the difference that she and other muckrakers made. There's a lot of women in the background of all of this. And so I tell a lot of the interesting stories about cases and what got us to today. See, that was a pretty quick soundbite of.
It was better than I would have done if someone asked me to summarize my book. I think that when people think about all this, you just mentioned the idea of tech and the big tech firms that have emerged just in the last couple of decades, really. What we're really talking about are companies like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple. And I think one thing your book did really well was draw home how this affects the consumer, how this affects people at home who depend on companies like Facebook and Google and Amazon, which have really become part of the infrastructure of America and how we live our lives today. I was wondering if you could get a little bit more into why the lack of any kind of updated antitrust regulation has affected sort of the modern day American consumer.
Sure. And let me start with non-tech stuff. In some areas, and I think one of the best examples for me is pharma, where you have cases, and this first came to my attention when I had just gotten to the Senate and I got a call from one of our children's hospitals, and I found out that this baby's heart drug called indomethacin, which had always been competitively priced and was affordable, had completely shot up, like up to like $1,600-$1,800 from where it was. And it was costing consumers and families, but also the hospitals, if the families couldn't afford it, for a common drug that had a competitor. Well, it turns out that the company that had the competitor, they basically both been sold to the same company. And I remember holding up the vial of the indomethacin as a new senator. I'm brand new. What should I do? To the FTC. FTC ends up bringing a case. Conservative Eighth Circuit, which defied a lot of experts' beliefs about how this should have gone, and upholds a Republican appointee's decision. And basically they say, sorry, can't do anything about it. And that was unbelievable to me. And you didn't have a competitor emerge for years and years. You saw the same thing basically with EpiPen more recently. And I care about this. My daughter carries one of them. And all the moms, of course, of the world immediately, and dads knew exactly what I was talking about. Again, there was lack of competition because things that had happened with the alternatives. So they just jack up the price. So in the end, I first saw this as a consumer issue and then quickly realized it's antitrust. Outside of the prices going up for things, you have other concerns that are much more insidious. And that is everything from probably positive example, AT&T breakup, right? Everyone thought, well, AT&T is fine. This is all going okay. I got my old phone. I got this when the cell phones were the size of Gordon Gekko's briefcase in the movie Wall Street. And then suddenly after the breakup, people realized, wait a minute, my long distance rates can go down. Yes, but there's all these new innovations in the cell phone market. So I bring up that innovation point because sometimes you just think, okay, what I got is okay. And you don't realize innovations that can actually make your life better. Like maybe if Facebook hadn't bought Instagram and WhatsApp, they would have eventually responded to the market demands for better privacy, for better protections for kids and the like. And you don't know that because they bought them. Because in the words of Mark Zuckerberg, I'd rather buy than compete. Those were his words in an email. I think that one of the things we do is we a lot of times talk about price. That's true. But there are other things that in the long term, big monopolies cut out a lot of innovations and bells and whistles, and especially in the tech area that would be good for consumers. But the most obvious examples are, online travel. Two companies own like 90% of it. I think it was John Oliver said that it's everything from cat food to caskets. And he ended his piece by saying, and if this makes you want to die, good luck, because there's only 3 casket makers. And I told him, no, I'm sorry, one bought the other, there's only 2. So we're seeing it all across the economy, not just in tech.
And, you've obviously been working on this since you were a first-time senator. I'm curious how your thinking of what's needed to write our antitrust policies has changed over the course of your career, and specifically over the course of writing a book, because I know when you're writing a book, you get to just live in these ideas for months and months at a time. And did the process of doing that and putting together this as a book make you sort of reevaluate how you yourself were thinking about what change we need?
Yes, I think my views pretty much stayed the same going back to when I was a young lawyer working. I represented MCI, and this was after the breakup, but they were still trying to get in the market against the monopoly local carriers. And it was just an ongoing saga in front of the public utility commissions across the country. So that was my first introduction to this. And so then I saw it as kind of back then, and I wrote about this in the book, but it was more of just these companies fighting each other, right? Then I get to the Senate and I start seeing the pharma stuff I just told you about. And then to me, it's like all consumer issue. Then as I keep looking at why this is going wrong, we're so used to maybe the court stepping in, like at the AT&T case. This isn't happening. I have Kavanaugh in front of me in the Judiciary Committee. I had Gorsuch in front of me. And when I asked them questions, their views, this was almost like, hey, look at me, when they would write these really, really conservative interpretations of the antitrust law. And it was almost a calling card with the Federalist Society to say, hey, look, I wrote this weird opinion. Can I make it? I really believe this, because some of them were just unnecessary, like one dissent with all the judges. And when I asked some questions about this, it even, made it worse. And that has been borne out, especially with Gorsuch. Kavanaugh had one decision where he actually sided with some of the other judges. But for the most part, they are not going to suddenly look at the antitrust laws and say, what bugs me about this so much is that they're supposed to be like looking at original intent. If you look at their judicial views, if you look at original intent of the Sherman Act, there's no way they would have thought, they never knew what the internet would be, but that one company should have 90% of the search market. All right. So the point of all this is that over time, I saw what we were up against. So that over time changed what I saw as some of the solutions, because it was no longer just courts. It was also, well, we need to look at the antitrust laws and start updating them for the times that we live in. We need to get more resources to the agencies, big time, because they're dealing with now record mergers, and they've got these big cases against Google and Facebook. We also need to look at things that I honestly hadn't been willing to look at before, like immunity for they're protected from any lawsuits. And I've started to realize as time goes on, even during the last 2 years, if they're going to resist every single thing, even bills like mine that say you can't self-preference your stuff and you can't, why would they have immunity? And because clearly they're not going to allow for any sensible government regulation. We can only rely on the private system to police them if they're going to do this. So I'm still not there 100% on a bill like that. I'm still waiting to see, as my dad would always say, I would say to him when we were on bike trips across country, I was waiting to see if he would improve before I would take the lead on the bike, because then I could draft behind him. So I'm waiting to see if something changes. But so far, it's been, to me, nearly flabbergasting, knowing what we're up against and how hard they're lobbying to not put any rules of the road in place.
So we're going to get to your bill in a little bit and just the events of the last.
You notice I keep bringing it up. Okay.
Yeah. No, we're gonna get there and
talk to the book, because the book is actually. In the book, I lay out all these solutions, including the bill, right? I have the list of things, new president that President Biden can do, who you put in place. I have a list of things Congress can do, and I have a list of things the public can do. So I tried to it's not just some book of history. I knew what we were coming into. And the other piece I realized looking at history and applying it to modern day is what really made change were these populist movements, right? And they wouldn't all be Democrats by any means, but they were the farmers with the pitchforks and the Granger movement. They were the union activists agitating against monopolies because that pushes down wages. And so I think we're seeing that today. It's not with the pitchforks, right? But there are a lot of farmers complaining about what's going on with meat packing and the like. There are a lot of, in our today's world, less organized groups, but real sentiment against this kind of consolidation and what's happening with pharma and what's happening with tech. And I think the Facebook whistleblower really turned a key. I mean, and I know you had, written all of this kind of as a precursor to that, but, one of the moms I talked to said that she felt like she trying to learn all this, and she basically wants to raise her kids and be a good mom, but they keep being exposed to stuff all the time that she doesn't want them to see. So she keeps trying to put filters on and do all this, and then they figure out their way around it, and then she has to go to her oldest kid to help her to figure out what to do. And she said it feels like a faucet that's on full time in her sink, and it's running over, and she just has a mop and she keeps trying to clean it up. And I think that's how a lot of parents feel right now.
Yeah. And just so to back up for a minute for people who are listening, we're talking about Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen. She worked at the company for several years. She previously worked at Google. She was an expert on things like how the algorithms, how Facebook's newsfeed feed you certain types of information and how that's been leading to misinformation and hate speech. And I think one of the most interesting things she said that really stuck with people was how the company makes a decision. She claims the company makes a decision constantly to keep certain things in the news feed that keep your attention, even knowing that those things might lead you to misinformation or hate speech or other unfortunate things, because its bottom line is its profit and it needs to keep you online as much as possible. Amy, I know people like Mark Zuckerberg disagree heavily with what Frances Haugen had to say, and he is the first person to say, well, I welcome regulation and we want nothing more than regulation. And I'm curious if you could walk us through, in the eyes of Mark Zuckerberg, what does regulation look like versus in the eyes of someone like you who's got a bill that you're trying to press through right now?
Okay, so they have made noises that, and this is Facebook. I'm not going to speak for the other companies because I've been on programs following some of their spokesmen, and they have said they're open to privacy legislation. And that is, of course, different than antitrust, but I'm a big fan of doing a federal privacy law. I think it would depend on what it looks like, what are the standards and things like that. That's something Senator Cantwell and I and a few others have a bill. And I don't think it's the one they want, but I'm not going to speak for them. So they've been open to that. They've been open to talking about their algorithms in terms of after closing them down from researchers. Nick Clegg, I remember this because I was on after he was at one point, and he said, well, we're open to having that looked at. So my issue there on the algorithms is that, and I've explained this to my colleagues, yeah, people are going to make hate comments or misinformation. Individuals are going to put that online. Okay. But the problem with the algorithms, it then becomes, to me, the responsibility of the company. Because if their algorithms are reinforcing and spreading it, that's a problem. And I made the analogy that it's like if you're in a theater and you yell and someone yells fire, that's not protected speech because it's not known as protected speech. Okay, but let's say the theater has all their exits that are safe, and so it's if there's someone breaks an ankle or something, like, is it really the theater that's liable? Yeah, probably not. But okay, what if the theater decided to broadcast it in all their multiplexes? So it created this complete stampede in every single theater. To me, that is different. They are actually their business product created a bigger problem than what it was in the first place. So that gets to our immunity issue. And I know that they don't want to mess around with that. The other thing that all of the tech companies seem concerned about is just putting some rules of the road to make sure that they're not producing their own products that they give preference to. They can produce their own products, Apple Music, Google Maps, whatever they're doing, but how come when they have, in the case of Google, 90% of the search market, would we as a country want them to also produce the products that they give preference to over everything else? That is getting to like the AT&T world from the past, where they had a monopoly over vertically, over all the machinery, and then horizontally over all the phone service. So Google has a monopoly, pretty much, we know this, 90%, I think that qualifies, over the search engine. But then are we also going to let them have a monopoly over everything that's under it that's advertised on there? We can let them produce. We're not saying they can't. Maybe a court would at some point say you shouldn't even be doing this. But all we're trying to do right now is say if you do it, you cannot compete unfairly against other advertisers and other companies. So to me, those kinds of things with the companies say they're open to can be very different, as you can tell, from where I think we need to go. And the last thing I think we need to do is to just do a bunch of stupid stuff that doesn't mean anything. Oh, why don't we do a study? What more do we need to study? We know what the numbers are. And so that's one of my obsessions is I'm tired of people doing feel-good legislation to say they did something on the internet when it won't make a difference. Some of my more, I'd say, aggressive ideas about doing something about mergers and shifting the burden, it's in the book. Right now, I've got some bills on it with the number of senators, but I don't have the kind of support I have for the rules of the road. So in the book, I lay out all these possibilities of things, including things about non-compete agreements and the like. And then through the real life, that's a little different with what you can actually get support on to move.
So tell me, I think of it like this. I think of it as three major buckets of bills or legislation that we're really looking at here. One has to do with what people can say on the internet. So, you should you be able to say X, Y, or Z thing? And a subsequent sort of factor of that is, should the company amplify it? So should we allow people to say—
First Amendment right to speak, right, versus amplification, and wait a minute, and also certain categories like sex trafficking, or which we have clearly gotten involved in the Senate, not in sex trafficking. The Senate has made clear that they're going to not have immunity for that, or misinformation on vaccines, right? Like that. So you also have types of speech,
right?
In addition to the amplification. Okay.
Right. So you have this first bucket, which is really complicated. And a lot of senators have gotten bogged down just in that first bucket, and they want to litigate which word is appropriate and what's not. But the amplification part of it is one that I think we're just recently beginning to talk about, which is not, should we discuss what you should and shouldn't say, or should we be discussing whether or not the company should be amplifying things that we universally agree upon as not being good for society, like sex trafficking of minors, right? I'm picking something extremely obvious, terrorism.
Did actually do something, but
so that's like,
okay. But one other thing is how they do it, right? The fact that you, as a politician, so I make a point, I do a bipartisan bill with, whoever, Chuck Grassley, John Cornyn. And so that's, that goes nowhere on the internet. Let's be honest, I put out, but I still keep trying. Okay, so how it is you get 5 times the traction if you have an angry emoji reaction versus a simple like. And so that does actually, I think, create polarized repetition of content and amplification. People see the stuff that's more, I guess you could say, sexy, but extreme on both sides. Okay, continue.
And therefore it's good for them as a business, right? So if free speech and amplification is the first bucket, the second bucket, if I understand it right, is the idea of just the monopoly of it all, right? Like, are these companies monopolies? What kind of antitrust behavior, or what kind of antitrust laws do we need to stop just a handful of companies from cornering the market, as they've done to date successfully on the internet, which is where all of us increasingly spend our time? And then I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit to the third bucket, which I think of as sort of more the privacy element, the privacy and security element of who should be held responsible when things go wrong, and should these companies be liable? And I'm not, Section 220, it's 230, sorry, is its own very wonky, we could spend a whole hour on that. But the responsibility issue for me is almost a third bucket. Mm-hmm. And I think when people talk about the internet companies, they tend to mix all three of those buckets together, and it sounds impossible when you're actually just talking about 3 separate things, 3 separate lanes that need to be tackled at once.
Right. And they fight almost everything. So, that also makes it seem very complicated to people. But the lane that mostly we're in with antitrust is the lane about competition. And there is an argument of why it can help in the other lanes, honestly, is that if you have true competition, so that you don't have one company with 90% or 70% or whatever, then that's what I meant about the bells and whistles. One of the ways you have competition is for price, but it's also for what you can get out of the product. Can you actually have a real platform where you're communicating, where you know who you're communicating with, or you can't have fake people? Can you have a real platform that's protecting kids so bad stuff so they can't be on there because you know who's registered, right? Mm-hmm. That's successful and has real money behind it. So the competition issue does flow into the other stuff, even though I agree with you on the buckets, because and the competition issue is maybe the most, it's not just the government saying, oh, hey, you have to do it this way. It's saying, let's let competition flourish by putting some road rails on. Let's listen to Adam Smith about the unbridled power of monopolies. And then if history is a guide, we will get more success in terms of the bells and whistles through the private sector. So ironically, after all that said, my way of doing this is arguably kind of the most market-based approach, right? Mm-hmm. And yet it involves government stepping in, but it's to promote competitive markets. So that's the choice I'd make.
And I mean, I think we've been waiting to this one start, but talk to us about your bill, because I think for people who aren't following this, your bill passed through committee earlier this week. And just to place it in time, we're talking about roughly the middle of January. Your bill passed through committee. Can you talk a little bit more about what's actually in your bill?
So this is a bill that looks at, as I said, the rules of the road, and looks at things like, let's start with something easy. Okay, Amazon, Wall Street Journal reporting and other places showed that you actually have some of your business outlets and some of your managers or whatever they are who are actually copying people's products who advertise on your platform, like the poor guy with the luggage organizer with a few employees. And suddenly the plans are copied and it ends up in Amazon Basics. So that to me, if anyone has to agree, this is not a good thing. And we've got to make it very clear that as a monopoly, you can't do that kind of stuff. Then you've got self-preferencing, which we've discussed, where you take it and they're self-preferencing their own products, like Google restaurant reviews over Yelp. And then you also have behavior where they're telling companies, okay, you guys, if you want to be rated near the top of our platform, you got to buy a bunch of our other stuff, small business. You've got to buy our distributions. You've got to do all this. So it's kind of getting at behaviors like that that allow them to have a leg up over other companies. And that's why I think we were able to Senator Grassley, that's appealing to him. He represents the state of Iowa, with a lot of small businesses. Although it is pretty funny. He's like, everyone has an Amazon plant. That's not enough to so he has a lot of small businesses. And then you have people like Senator Durbin, who's always been interested in consumer issues, Senator Graham, who's been willing to take on internet companies before, which is a whole nother thing because some people just don't even want to mess with it. And then you have just a vast array of different political ideologies, from Mazie Hirono to Josh Hawley to Mark Warner, who really understands this in terms of the business perspective, having been in tech before and done well in tech. And so what I did was I put together a group that was focused on this competitive market issue.
And I think, I mean, what's interesting of the people you just know, this isn't a partisan group that you put together. Mm-hmm. It's been a fairly bipartisan, and as a reporter covering this, I want to just know that it's fairly unique for there to be bipartisan support of a bill like this, and for it to not fall according to party lines.
Yeah, and also for it not to fall apart when the votes come, because sometimes people will just go off, and there are different views of these people, believe me. But in this case, we actually gained support despite the lobbying campaign against it. And so I thought that was a tribute to people who are willing to stand up. So, that's what this bill is. There's a bill coming up, as you know, Shira, on app stores. And this mostly involves Apple and Google, and the fact that companies are paying 30%, which gets filtered through to consumers who are on the app stores for Apple phones, Google for other phones, and how they also are not able to advertise, hey, you can get a cheaper deal on the web if you go to our website. Yet app stores have, in some cases, replaced the web. I now understand why some of the stores I sometimes shop on online don't have apps. I never quite know, why don't they have an app? They're pretty big. Well, they've just made a business decision. They're not going to pay that much. And yet it's really hurting them compared to other companies. So that's pretty much what that bill's about. There's another one on news organizations being able to get better rates and being able to negotiate, because for small newspapers, that's really hard to do. That's another one that we're going to be taking on soon. And that, of course, involves Facebook and some of the other companies. So there's many different issues going on, including the privacy bills I mentioned out of the Commerce Committee.
These companies that you are talking about, Facebook, Google, Amazon, they have some, I think Facebook alone has the largest lobbying wing in all of Washington, D.C. What sort of lobbying have they done to try and slow down your bill?
Whenever one of my colleagues bring up an argument, I'm like, okay, let's talk about it. But I just want you to think about it, because it's just what this other senator said. So maybe someone gave you that argument that you don't even know is on the payroll. So you need to at least ask them if they're on the payroll, because they have 2,500 lobbyists And they have different people targeted to different members. I mean, this isn't new, right? Big companies hire, but this magnitude, they've been in the top group of companies hiring lobbyists now for a number of years. So it's unprecedented in terms of the sustained effort and the number of people. And then you have the unprecedented David and Goliath situation, because I have exactly 3 lawyers working on this, and who are outstanding, as I remind them every day. And so, it is an unequal situation. So, but we just keep persevering and getting the facts and working with the other Senate offices that care about this. So that's part of it. And it's, as I mentioned before, Congress does really well usually in short-term important stuff. They don't usually mess around with long-term unimportant stuff, but they spend a lot of time in the quadrant of short-term unimportant stuff that's in the news. And the hardest is where we are with tech. That is long-term important stuff, because it's not right in front of them, except for maybe some crises that develop, like with our democracy or other things that are very apparent. But this has been long-term for a long time, and I think it's increasingly becoming short-term, which is why there's much more interest in moving bills.
And just to be clear, when we're talking about short-term, long-term, are we talking about the 9 months left until the midterms? Is that what we're, I mean, I think some people forget that we have midterms coming up this year in November. And there is a lot
I was talking about decades of short-term, but on the front of this year, that is correct, Shira. And so we are working against a clock, because in the fall, it's really hard to get anything done. And so we need floor time from the 2 leaders in the Senate. The House, and this has been bad, we haven't mentioned the House, because David Cicilline and Ken Buck, Republican, and many other House members really led the way on this for 18 months with their investigation. And they also need to start moving those bills to the floor. And they also have bipartisan support for their bills. And they have to, they're coordinating with us about what bills, as we look to get floor time in the Senate. I will say 2 bills are already on the move. One is our Grassley and my bill, which has a counterpart in the House, to change the merger fees and bring in over $100 million for the agencies. That's passed the Senate and is almost guaranteed to get on another bill and get through the House in the next month or 2. The other one is the venue bill, which allows state attorney generals, including, since we're at the Commonwealth, California's attorney general has been supportive of this, to keep the suits in their own state, when instead of allowing the tech companies to move them and slow them down by bringing them to other venues. So that's called we call it the venue bill. And that's another bill that is also on the move. And that's Buck, Cicilline, and Lee and me in the Senate.
I just want to send a little reminder for people to send in their questions. We're going to start getting to those questions in roughly 5 minutes time. But before we do, I just want to recap. We have, your bill, the House bills, which are going to be looking at the antitrust, the monopoly issues. I think a lot of people are still holding out hope that Section 230 gets reformed. And just to very quickly and give an oversimplification of that, it is the question of whether tech companies should be held liable for what is on their platform. And for a long time, Section 230 has protected them, in a sense, from being held liable. Do you think it's realistic that we're going to be looking at Section 230 reform in the next 5 years, 10 years? What kind of timeline?
Yeah. This is one where, does something, depending on what happens, is there a sudden rush to do something about it? Possibly, given all this stuff that's going on. But I look at it as more that, few year, I won't say 5, but few year thing. And the question is, do you carve out certain areas? Because there's not agreement. Now, this is one where there's not agreement across the aisle, right? Mm-hmm. Misinformation on one side, political stuff on the other. So is it better just to do it based on size, based on amplification, how much amplification there is of certain types of speech, or do you just do full out immunity? It goes away for people that when you can show harm of some kind, of falsehoods basically or something, and you do that by not punishing, say, and this is what some of the senators say to me, well, people put jerky comments on all the time. I'm like, of course they do. That happens, right? And but this is about the amplification piece of it and what that means. So.
Right. And, I just want to note one thing I think about when I think about all these laws and how important they are right now is this idea of the metaverse that all these companies are rushing to. Facebook has obviously renamed itself as Meta. I really should be calling it Meta.
We should have noted that, just like I didn't note the house, which was bad.
I still have trouble remembering to call it Meta, but it's not the only company. Apple, Google, they're all in a race right now to create this immersive online experience, which they want us living our lives in. And I think academics and researchers who are looking at all this say it's even more important for the legislation and the regulation to happen now, because whatever problems we have with the internet now will be that much more amplified when we are in some kind of holistic virtual reality experiment where we viscerally see and feel everything around us.
Yes, I agree.
And I think
my metaverse answer.
I'm just going to get started with some questions because I think we already have some good ones here. The first is, do you think politicians who oversee policy should be banned from investing in the same companies they are regulating? Do you see this as related to your bill?
Okay, so I am not a fan of investments by politicians, and there are some limits in place on the Stock Act, as you know, that's already in place in Congress. And, I would support expanding that. I'd want to look at what the legislation is. And yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. So, I don't have investments outside of a 401k like most people have that is invested by someone else. And so I think that it can lead to, even though for many people it may not influence what they're doing, it can lead to the appearance of that. And I think that can be a problem.
And another question we've got here is, what can be done about vertical integration? For instance, like Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, since I did talk about that horizontal. I always remind people that's like Pepsi and Coke merging, right? Horizontal versus vertical, what's owned under them. I think that you've got to look at the market. You've got to look at the businesses in the market to figure out if it's an antitrust violation. And that's, we have special rules when it comes to, say, TV stations, if they're in the same market, and sometimes there's waivers and the like. But I think the issue for me right now, as opposed to allowing the Justice Department and the FTC to look at specific cases, is because we've been doing that a long time. We have these hearings, we throw popcorn at the CEOs, and then that's the end of it. We make news one night. Okay, everyone go home. We're not really going to do anything. I'm just tired of it. And that's why what I'm looking at is putting in some specific rules of the road. I'll say this over and over again, to make it much better off in terms of allowing competitors to compete in the market.
Another good one here. If Tim Cook spent 40 minutes on the phone with Senator Ted Cruz and couldn't convince him to vote against your bill, does this show that there's true bipartisan traction?
I don't know where to go with that one. I did think that was interesting when Ted Cruz revealed that fact. And, I'm very clear, I, of course, wasn't going to turn down a meeting. I want to hear from these. There's nothing wrong with that at all, that companies are talking to us or we're talking to them. That's part of getting legislation done. And you want to know what their views are and what they see as concerns. In my personal view, we not only made some changes to the House bill, to the point where the Washington Post editorial page said, finally, a tech bill that can, basically they were saying, that can advance. But then after listening to Tim Cook and some of the other CEOs, we made very clear some security exceptions and changes. We made it very clear, which we always knew, that Amazon Prime, one of the more amusing hits on the bill, was not covered, but we even clarified it more, that we weren't going to take Amazon Prime away from people like me. And so that was very clear. So I think in terms of the support we got for the bill, it was everyone from liberals to conservatives and people in between, honestly. So that was very important to me. But I can't, I think that The CEOs have a right to make their case. We should listen. We then have to respond. And so what I don't like is when people just listen and take everything they say hook, line, and sinker, because then another lobbyist reinforces it that they know from home. That's the kind of stuff that's going on, or someone that used to work at a government agency that says something. I mean, there's just a lot of things out there that get said in these meetings. And so all I ask my colleagues to do is to ask questions and then step back and look at it and come back to us, which they have been doing, and ask us to answer their questions that have been raised by the lobbyists or the CEOs.
Well, but now I obviously have to ask, has Tim Cook spent 40 minutes on the phone with you, and not just him, but have any other tech CEOs called you and tried to?
I actually, and I think this has gone public because after Ted Cruz revealed that breaking news in the hearing, I was asked that, and I had met with Sundar, the head of Google, actually met with him for over a half hour, and then also with Tim Cook, yes.
Okay.
At different times. They had, of course, different issues, but I didn't ever hide that. I think that it's important. And, it's probably good they're talking to other people and not just Ted, they're talking to everyone. So we know that. My problem is that their lobbyists are amplifying things, saying things. I think there's a lot of scare tactics. And the most amusing thing is every time we make some change that Grassley and I and the rest of the authors agree to is just clarify something or is necessary. Now they go, oh, see, their bill was bad, as opposed to saying, you know what, they're listening to people. And then the other thing I warn them is, we're not going to get to the point where this bill does nothing. So, they will, I tell my colleagues, until it does nothing, they won't support it. So you're going to have to deal with it. This is not a popularity contest with the tech CEOs.
Right.
No. You win the popularity contest if you don't support the bill. So let's just be honest about that with the CEOs. Yeah.
Do you worry that conservative federal courts will sympathize with the companies when antitrust lawsuits get filed?
I don't know that. I worry not that it's because it's the companies or which companies it is, because as we know, even during the Trump administration, Macon Delrahim, he brought that case against Google, and Chairman Simon over at the FTC brought the case against Facebook. So there were conservatives and that were actually pushing the envelope on this. But when we get to the courts, even if they may agree with them on some of this in their heads, they've created such conservative precedent in other cases that it makes it very hard. Now, maybe they'll find some unique way to disagree or to allow a suit to proceed. And we've got the Justice Department and FTC have some good facts here. But one of the reasons I think we need to change the law is to make it very clear to the court where Congress is, and that their rulings notwithstanding, the world has changed. Nearly 20% of the economy is tech, or the world has changed. These pharma companies are doing really bad stuff right now when it comes to consumers, and we're got to put some safeguards in place. That's what we do as members of Congress. So hopefully that will help, and then the final thing I already mentioned, when I go back to the original intent of these laws, I'm like, and why did you get to where you are? Because of Judge Bork's rulings, I guess. But maybe this is, if you're willing to step back, here's one, Shira. If you're allegedly willing, you're now looking at Roe v. Wade, you're looking at all this precedent. Sherman Act's been around a long time. Maybe you need to look at the mess that has been created within the world of antitrust, yes. But I can't guarantee that will happen.
Right. I mean, and I think whatever the courts do or don't do is left to be seen on a number of issues, not just this one. Mm-hmm. What do you think about shifting ownership of data from the platforms to the individuals being harvested? Governor Gavin Newsom has referred to a data dividend.
Yeah, exactly. And I talked about this, I think, at South by Southwest when I was on the presidential campaign, and that was trying to put a tax on this, or because all these consumers are out there. And I think my favorite monetization of how much they're earning for the companies, and I want to get this right, but I think, so this is a caveat because I'm doing it from memory, but it was something like $200 a quarter or something like that, that Facebook was making off of consumers that are their users. in the US. And then when you looked at other countries that have a little more rules in place, or maybe it was significantly less. And so when you look at that, and this is their own reports that we got this data, you realize, wow, they're making a lot of money off us because they have our data and then they target ads to us and they sell it to advertising, which you so greatly pointed out that business model in your guys' book. And so I think it's a really interesting idea. I actually proposed it at South by Southwest. And, Californians often ahead of the curve on some of these new laws and new approaches. And so I think that would be a really interesting thing to do. And you could also, of course, do it federally.
And there's one question here that I missed earlier, which actually is very near and dear to my heart, which is who decides what is hate speech and why is it so tricky to answer this question?
Well, you have, what is the court standard, when you see it in terms of pornography. Well, there have been Supreme Court rulings on what this protected speech is under the First Amendment and what is not. And that's, I use the example of fire in a crowded theater, things inciting violence, but also things that are hate speech. And there's actually many laws on the books for hate crimes, including one that I had under my jurisdiction when I was the DA. And so hate speech is based on the law in the state, in the country. And so one of the things that we have tried to do, Senator Warner actually led a bill on this with Mazie Hirono and myself on discriminatory speech and speech, violent speech and things like that, and why does it matter? It gets to your third bucket, because then you shouldn't have immunity if you are putting that kind of stuff out on the platform for whatever repercussions there are from that. So it's a boring legal answer to your question.
Well, no, I don't think a lot of people realize how complicated the hate speech issue is, and something we get into this in the book.
As opposed to an opinion, someone's opinion, and what the line is. Yes.
We get into it a little bit in the book. We actually, I think at one point had a whole chapter and we had to cut it for the sake of readability. But Germany has actually taken such a very different approach to this than the US has. And because of what happened in Germany during World War II, they actually have some of the world's strongest, some really sort of strong anti-hate speech laws, which
are much more First Amendment in our or how about, I was just talking to the French ambassador today about some of the work, Ukraine, but also what's going on in the tech world, and they've been taking a lead in France, there we talked about that they just can put limits on what was reported basically the few days before an election, and remember how they basically took stuff off the internet that went on. And some of that going on with ads, but it was so, one platform did that, but their laws allow a different approach to their elections basically. And so, our country has had a much different approach. So one of the things that we have to do is deal with the existing laws and how we can make change that's still legal, under our Constitution and the like. And so that gets to some of the questions you had and why you so well put it into these different buckets. Because a lot of this stuff I'm talking about, as much as people try to sometimes bring this up on mostly on the right side, but sometimes on the left side of the aisle, this is really much more straight competition policy.
Right. And just to give people a bit of the history here, in Germany, you have to remove hate speech within a certain window of time. Companies like Facebook and YouTube, if they don't take it down within a certain amount of time after it's reported to them, they get penalized, they get fined. And as a result, companies like Twitter, YouTube, Facebook have had to put tens of thousands of employees in Germany so that they can be really responsive and take down hate speech as quickly as it appears, as opposed to here in the US, where they their own rules prohibit certain types of hate speech, but they do it on their own timeline. And there are countries in the world where moderation isn't done very well. Of course, Myanmar is the country that always pops into my mind first, where it could take months, right? It could take months for a piece of
and it spread all over the place and created issues. So exactly. So.
We have another question here. And I just want to note, you have a couple minutes left to get in your questions. If you have any last questions, please put them in the chat. Another one we have here is there anything we can do to help persuade members of Congress in California, including Democrats who get a lot of support from big tech, to support your legislation? I think they might be thinking of a specific Democratic senator when they say that.
Mm.
Member comments.
I think you just have to make your case. I will say that, Senator Padilla made very clear at our hearing that he wanted to work with us on this going forward. They both, senators voted, I think surprised some people by voting to advance the bill that I just had. That Senator Grassley and I had in front of the committee. But of course, they've made very clear that they wouldn't necessarily vote for it on the floor. You have House members as well, and I think there's difference of opinion in the big state of California, which is basically as big as many countries or bigger. You've got just different views as well in the state, and I just think it's important to keep making the case because believe me, the companies are making the case, and we haven't really talked about this, but we don't. I want these companies to be successful. I'm glad they employ people, and it's not just in California. They employ people in other places as well. They've given us incredible innovations. I was going to say I wear a Fitbit, and I realized I charge it and have lost all my steps for the day. So this was actually a really sad moment for me right now at this moment, Shira, right here on the call in front of everyone. I have an iPhone. I am not some Neanderthal on tech. I use these innovations. I've ordered online through the pandemic. I get all that. But that doesn't mean that as a nation, it's one of the hallmarks of our country is that we've always rejuvenated capitalism. And when someone gets to dominate in a market, we're supposed to be stepping in and not saying, you're bad, we want to get rid of your whole ideas in your company. No. We're saying we want to make sure that it's an even marketplace so we can get the next Google. And we had a number of startups actually that came out on our side on this bill and made very clear why. And I think that's part of it.
Right. And I just want to note, early in the conversation, we talked about these tech companies essentially becoming like utilities to many Americans. People, not just here really, but especially in the United States, WhatsApp, Facebook Marketplace, Twitter, YouTube, all these things have become sewn into the fabric of our lives. And I don't think it's realistic that they're going to up and disappear, which is something you hear of a lot of, why don't you just delete this thing? Why don't you just delete this company?
And you feel it like sometimes, but you could just get off the platform if you want. But I think one of that the counter to that is that's a scare tactic that the companies are using when we know very well that our bill won't do that. And we have had so many experts say this. They're basically, they may not say they know they can't say it's going to destroy their whole company, but they say it's destroy certain things they do that you guys love. And we just don't see it that way at all. So, and nor do a lot of other senators that have looked at this really carefully before they started to be willing to take on the biggest companies the world has ever known.
Oh, and here's one that I love. I know I have an answer for this one. Is there a favorite part or story from your book or something that got left out that you wish had made it in?
Let's see. Well, there was my husband, as I note in the book, helped me with a lot of the footnotes. He wrote a lot of these. He wrote these footnotes, and he has 200. A lot of stuff that he would have liked to remain in. We would have had like double the footnotes based on some of the research. So I'll say that on his behalf. He's a law professor and a good writer and is a death penalty expert, actually. In terms of some of my favorite stories, I actually, for me personally, this whole part I did about how growing up, I didn't really understand monopolies. I, played the game Monopoly and I was so competitive. I'd like try to beat my grandma all the time. I would, and the whole concept was to buy more and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I did not think about the history of this with my family, my grandpa and my great grandparents coming over from Slovenia to work in the mines. And they were basically working for the monopolists at the time, whether the mines back then in northern Minnesota were owned by the railroads, but many were owned by James J. Hill. And hilariously, when I was growing up, James J. Hill was, of course, long dead, but my mom would take us at Christmas time, driving by in her little red Comet, the Monopoly house of James J. Hill, built metaphorically by my grandpa, since my great grandpa had come over the year he was building the house, and he worked in the mines, and my grandpa worked in the mines. And the Klobuchars had literally built the house. And so I think those connections, when people can see it in their own lives, and my grandma with my dad growing up and his brother, she's like, okay, we got a better place in America. Our kids can go to school, but this is the last generation working for the mining monopoly right now. And now it's, there's different competitors, but in her mind, she was going to try something else for her kids.
I love that. We have another question here. How about facilitating data portability and service interoperability? That worked well in the wireless market and should work similarly in social media, search, et cetera.
Very good question. And I know Senator Warner had a bill he'd been working on in the past that I think he's still focused on. I think there's a bill over in the House on this. He's actually knows a lot about this. And I believe that is a very good approach as well. So that's something else that the House has worked on that we could incorporate in a bill when we get to the floor.
And just to explain to people who are listening in, data portability is the idea that you'd be able to take your data if you did want to leave the company. If you did,
I was talking about the interoperability, but you're right, yes. The data portability about your stuff. So if you went to another platform, that you could bring it with you, that you own it, not the company.
Right. I mean, I think one thing that we were, when I think of writing the book and Facebook and how much I knew about Facebook before I wrote it, one thing I wasn't aware of and was shocked to discover was just how much data they sit on individuals. And I know Google is even more immense, as far as I've been told by people who work there. I question whether the average American realizes how much data these companies have amassed on people.
Or how much they think is their secret stuff and they have it, and how much I think people do know when it happens. Like you send an email about, turn on your air conditioning, and suddenly you got air conditioner ads. And senators have, throughout hearings, as have witnesses, used examples like that. And they actually, in real time, when I'm having these hearings, people tweet publicly examples of what just happened to them when they were talking about the hearing. So I think people know that, but I don't think they know how much money they're actually making off of them, and how that should be their information, their data. That money should be coming to them with some, normal profit for the company that's using the data, but instead they're just hoarding all their data and making money off of them. And right. Sometimes I think that's a really good approach for getting people to understand this, because it's hard when you just want to go buy something online and you just don't even realize what's going on and why you picked a certain product.
The one thing that struck me as creepy is the best word I can come up with here, was that they know things about you that you might not know yourself. So they can, using their data on literally billions of data points of people all over the world, they can say whether someone like you is likely to want to buy a house in the next year, have a child in the next year, get married to the person you're currently dating. And they can use this data to make really interesting and scarily accurate predictions about you and your life before you can. Yeah.
The brave new world. So, I mean, it's getting more and more. And it just, again, to step back to our real world as opposed to the metaverse, it should make the people demand some action from Congress up front. And the administration, who put good people in place in these jobs now. And now it's time to get some action.
We have one last question here, which I think is actually
you keep telling me there's more questions.
This is the last one, I promise, and I actually think it's a perfect question to end on. It's a really good one. What is your elevator pitch for Americans to support your bill? I want to tell other people about it. So do you have your 60-second elevator pitch?
Sure. America has thrived on competition. It's what made us the envy of the world, and new ideas and new products, and allowing new people to create new things. And right now we've got monopolies that are the gatekeepers controlling that in the dominant tech platforms. And we've got to adjust our laws so that we can continue rejuvenating those new ideas and allow other products to get on the market.
Right. Thank you so much. Our thanks to Senator Amy Klobuchar for joining us today and discussing her new book, Antitrust, coming out in paperback. We'd also like to thank our audience for watching and participating live. If you'd like to watch more programs supported or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/events. I'm Shira Frankel. Thank you, and stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, Shira. Thank you to everyone. Bye.